Hello, my name is Teddy, and today we are going to look at how to handle errors or exceptions in Python. So for example, you have a variable that is not defined, let's say a variable x, and you say you want to print that variable x. So what will happen if you run this file? We're going to get a traceback which comes in this format. So we're going to look at a better way of handling this error so that we get something like name x is not defined other than getting all this stack trace that is here. This helps the users to better understand what error has occurred, so that it does not come also showing the file location and other things that are not needed from a tracing perspective. So before we get started, kindly subscribe to my channel and like and comment of anything that you like us to do in any tutorial. So let's get started. So we're going to look at the syntax of how to handle these errors. So the syntax is normally you do a try catch or try except. Other languages use try catch exceptions, but for now, for us, we're going to use try except in Python. So you do try, then you print your x, then you do except. Take note of the 4 spaces after try. This is where we define our function or statement that are going to run. Then we do except. This is where we are going to handle the error that occurs. So we're going to print and say x is not defined. So if we run this function, we are going to get x is not defined. So this one has been output in the best way. Now this is how one way of handling errors in Python. So you can have different or multiple exceptions in Python. For example, let's say let's define our variable. Let's say x equals to 1, and then we run this function. What are you going to get? It's going to print x equals to 1. So assuming you are saying x print x over 0. If we run this function, we are going to get x. We are going to get 1, and x is not defined. So for this one, it's a 0 division exception, not a name error. So we are not going to say x is not defined and yet is defined. So we are going to add another exception that handles x is not divisible by 0. So we're going to except this. So here we can say, the first except you can say name error. In the second one you can say except 0 division error, and say print x is not divisible by 0. So if we run this, we are going to get x is not divisible by 0. So this is the correct error that has occurred, and not x is not defined, because x is already defined. So if we don't define x, what happens? We are going to get x is not defined. So we have that sequence of exceptions that are happening. So if the first one is not right, it just gives you that error for the first one. If the subsequent one is not correct, then it gives you the error for the subsequent one. So this is the easy way of how to handle errors in Python. So another way of finalizing this, for example, you are opening a file or you are closing a database connection. We normally have something called finally, just to close out on the syntax. So this normally is used when you want to close maybe a database connection, or when you have opened a file and you want to close that file. So we normally use the word finally. It's not a must for you to use it, but it's good for you to use it when you have in other scenarios where you're opening a file and you want to close that file, or you're opening a database connection and you want to close that database connection after all transactions have occurred. So here we are going to say print. So this statement is executed irrespective of whether there is an exception or not. So we are going to say closing statement. So if we run this, always closing statement will be there irrespective of whether we have an exception or not. So for example, we have a database connection and you got an error. You just close that connection so that other connections can open. So that we have the term finally in our syntax. You might also want, or you might also like to raise an exception without using the try catch. So for example, you have a condition, and inside that condition, if it's not met, and then you are going to raise an exception, not using the try catch method. So let's look at that way of how we can raise an exception. So assuming you have a value x equals to a 1, and you want to use a value that is greater than 1. So if the first conditions, you say if x is less than, let's say, 2, then you want to raise an exception because you want to use the value 2 and above just to do your computation, or you want to carry out some condition. So we are going to use a raise keyword just to raise your exception. Then say x is less than 2. So if we run this, we are going to get the trace back x is less than 2. So this is another way of raising an exception in Python. So these are the basics of handling exceptions or errors in Python. If you like this tutorial, kindly comment below, subscribe, like this tutorial, as we look forward to learning other new things in Python. Thank you.